Hello, everyone. Welcome back to yet another episode of Proudly Made in Africa. Today, I'm honored to have with us Christopher O'Connell. He's a highly anticipated guest that we've wanted to have on the show, and we're really excited. So, thank you for joining us today, Chris. Um, just a brief overview. Chris is a remarkable advocate and researcher his work on civil rights, democracy, and especially in the sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America, EU and beyond, has not gone unnoticed. I think, yeah, he's also working with Trocare, who has been able to work with a lot of organizations in helping bring awareness to certain situations and help foster, trade justice within different aspects of the supply chain. So, Chris also is not only a Caroline Research Fellow with Dublin City University and Anti-Slavery International, but also actively involved in the Latin American Solidarity Center. So there's always so much more we can dabble into, but most importantly, we want to, gain some insights from Chris' perspective while working with a lot of organizations and just trying to unravel some of these things that we might not have direct answers to. So, Chris, once again, thank you. Thank you for joining us today.
Very much, Raj. It's a pleasure to be here talking to you.
Awesome. God bless. So, I just wanted to start off first of all with the question from not just my perspective, from the listeners, which is, where are we today in this whole landscape of justice, trade, the global market, especially understanding that we're trying to come from what's happening in Africa, because the gist is Africa is rapidly growing, because we have like the market. So we say in EU compared to EU, they have more stability. Things are growing, but on a slower plane. Meanwhile, in Africa, radical changes are happening, which makes things happen faster, but still, on a global scale, seems to be not as much. So we're trying to understand, how did we get here? What were those factors that really set things up to where we are? And what is it like today in this landscape that we're dealing with?
So yeah, big questions, very big questions. And I mean, I'm not going to, put myself out there as an expert on all of these things, but I can speak to some of the conclusions that I've come to through research and more, and also in terms of working in a sort of a non-governmental organization like Trocra. And yeah, I should just clarify, I'm here kind of speaking on my own behalf and not speaking for Trocra, and so any mistakes are entirely mine in terms of where things are at and growth and those sorts of things. I mean, I think, my view is that we live in a world economic system, and that economic system, has its roots. In particular, I would trace them back to the conquest of the Americas, over 500 years ago, and then the subsequent, colonization of most of Africa, and even though the world sort of formally politically decolonized in sort of post World War II years,
Yeah.
I still think that a lot of that colonial system lives on, and it lives on in different ways. For me and the work that I do on sort of on corporate accountability, I would see the kind of key actors in terms of maintaining that kind of neo-colonial system as being the corporation, the private company. It was integral to that whole process of colonization, particularly pioneered by the British. So India, was not conquered and ruled for a long time by Britain. It was conquered and ruled by the East India Company, and only more recently in the history of India was it actually taken formally under control of the British state. And so we live in this world system, but then we're governed by individual states, and so there's a sort of difficulties in terms of the scales of that. And then we must also recognize that this world system doesn't just benefit individual corporations or wealthy individuals. It also benefits certain states much more than others. And so what we can see is that many of the wealthiest states have, through most of their history, benefited from, and that's why they're the wealthiest countries, have benefited from this system. And even now, in a sort of system of formal equality, where every state is supposed to, enter the UN as an individual equal state, we can see very clearly all of the architectures that mean that that is not so. So to go back to your question then on sort of growth in Africa, I mean, I suppose the question I would always have is pushing beyond statistics like GDP per capita, to look to think really about who is benefiting from that growth, where are the benefits of that growth being felt, primarily within the individual nations in Africa, but also outside of it. Because what you have is largely then in many of the parts of the world that were formerly colonized and are now formally decolonized, you still have very much a push to have a race to the bottom, in order to benefit from this world system, in order to be one of the winners in a system that ultimately can only have a few winners. So yeah, and then the other thing, I suppose, in terms of the thing that gets talked about less beyond growth is redistribution as well.
No, actually, you were on point, I think, and it just makes me understand certain things regarding the chain of evolution. So it was like certain groups, certain countries understood that they needed to get a head start, and as a result, there is this benefit that they still reap because. I think one of the strategy that the British colony had was, even though they were a tiny island, they were able to divide and conquer, right? So that was their strategy, and it's still, it's like children of those strategies are still very prevalent in African society today, which, like, division is one of the strongest things. But the question is there any proof to show that there can only be a few selected winners and there is no reason for the African society development and markets to, be a major player in this global trade space?
Yeah, that's another good question, another big one. I suppose there are a few different aspects to this as I would see it. So in theory, no. And in theory, particularly going back to the late 20th century, when we had the Cold War and you had a sort of polar system, you had some space, I think, for social democracy,
Yeah.
or different forms of sort of leftist
Yeah.
politics of states that were sort of nationalist, but kind of resource nationalist a lot of the time, who tried to take control of particularly of their natural resource wealth, and have some level of redistribution. But depending on where they were, that was more or less possible. So Sweden could do it, but when Guatemala tried to do it in 1954, the CIA sponsored a coup and put the president out of power. Similar things happened in Congo, and other parts of the world. So there's always been this, I think, differential in power. But in theory, now what we have is you could have, in countries that are formally considered democratic, you could elect a progressive government that would decide to redistribute more of that wealth. But the fact is that there are lots and lots of things that push back against that. The ones that are portrayed as the most successful, in the Western world in particular, are the ones that are most friendly to business. Um,
Okay.
those that are not friendly to business, those that try to impose higher taxes, more stringent environmental standards, better labor standards, those sorts of things that can actually improve the livelihoods and the health and well-being of their citizens, tend to be punished in different ways. And that can take the form of not investing there, or it can take the form of political interference, or we can take the form of something which links very much directly into the whole area of trade justice, which is the investor settlement dispute system, and ISDS as it's called, that's written
Yes.
into trade agreements, and in particular, it's written into bilateral investment treaties. And these bilateral investment treaties have been signed by countries, particularly across the global south, with countries of the global north, um, on very bad terms for the global south. And what this whole system allows is it allows corporations to sue those states, but it doesn't allow for the opposite to happen. It doesn't allow for states to sue companies, and that the companies can sue the states basically on the basis of lost profits that they had anticipated that they might make sometime in the future. So, for examples, we'll say a mining company that granted a concession to mine a particular metal, they might not have even set up any operations in the country, but if the country then decided actually it was going to rescind that concession or change its laws, as El Salvador did to ban metal mining
Yeah.
entirely, then what happens is those countries get sued under this system, and these suits can be for billions of dollars. They may not always win. It is an arbitration system, but it's very opaque. There is some research that suggests that 60% of the cases are won by the company and not by the state.
Wow.
But even the threat of this, the risk of that, in the main, acts as a chilling has a chilling effect on countries. So when countries go to change their tax laws, or change their environmental laws, or change their labor laws, they have to consider this. And so, yeah, all of these are examples of that system at work that you know privileges the interests of corporations over many states.
That's a huge eye opener. So the question now, I think many people will be asking is there any situation where ISDS, the likes of ISDS, because I'm sure there are other forms of this, is there any situation where it serves any good to the public, where, or is it just a way that the rich keep getting rich and governments are stuck playing defense?
In essence, no, I can't see anything for the countries, and there has been some research. There's a book I could recommend called Silent Coup that goes
Hmm.
through this in quite detail, where they talked about how the signing of these bilateral investment treaties were rejected, and pushed back against by many countries in the global south. But again, we saw oftentimes political interference or sponsoring of coups against those sorts of leaders, and they are ultimately then often replaced by leaders. This is the sort of the hard power side of all of this that backs up, corporate interests a lot of the time. And so, a lot of these were signed, particularly in the 1990s, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, when you then move to a unipolar system where the West, largely led by the United States, but with the European Union there as well, is seen, and capitalism is the only game in town, and countries around the world are told that if they want to develop, then they need to get on board with this, and these sorts of treaties are what are required by this new situation. That they needed to guarantee what would be described as a stable investment environment for corporations. Um, and so,
Wow.
so yeah, so this is what was done. And we can see also just how difficult it is to extricate yourself from this system. So a country where I lived for a number of years in South America, Ecuador, under a
Yeah.
previous government, served notice that it was going to leave the ICSID system, which is the ISDS system run by the World Bank, and it has been sued, and lost a huge case to Occidental Petroleum, an oil company, that was very, very costly, and has had numerous other suits filed against it. And similarly, more recently, Honduras has done the same thing, where they have decided to exit this system, And the Transnational Institute in the Netherlands just produced a report a couple of weeks ago that said that since they announced that, I think it was earlier this year or late last year, they have been hit by almost 20 suits of this nature, and all of them would be in the billions. So for a country like Honduras, even to think, right, 50% of these cases might lose, that's still a cost of billions. And there's also the cost of defending those cases and paying for lawyers and so on and so forth. So you can see why very many countries decide that the easier thing is to stay within the
Okay.
system.
Hmm. Wow, that is something. So when I think about this, it seems like the powers that hold, the strong ones still hold the power, or they always make an effort to maintain that power. So there's something about the corruption level, for instance, in Nigeria. While growing up, we always assumed that the politicians have all the money, they're stealing all the money, and hopefully one day when they have stolen enough, they would do good for the people. But it never comes, it never happens. And then I think back and compare it to the slavery and all that time. When that was happening, this went on for hundreds of years. That's just to tell you that it's never really just becomes enough. The powerful people always want more and more, and it never ends. So what can Africa learn from this situation? It's not like someone is going to come and give them a handout. I was going to talk a little bit about the AIDS, but that can come later. The main question is, what can Africa learn from the current situations? Because we do have, like, what's it called? Organizations that bring everybody together and try to assign uh, agreements, right? But the question is, the powerful countries are still gonna have the veto power. For example, where I heard African countries can't have veto power, but they're invited to the table. So what can they learn and what can they do about the situation?
I would say individually it's very difficult. Because again, we're talking about a world system. We're talking about a multi-layered architecture that is primarily aimed at keeping, um, largely speaking, the global south, keeping uh, those countries in the sort of dependent position that they have been since colonization, keeping them in the position of, providing cheap, or I would say cheapened resources, cheapened labor, uh, to this world system. That is the architecture of the world system. Now, every so often, a country in particular can sort of break out, as I've mentioned, but and that is, that's part of the problem. That you have as a leader of any particular country, or government of any particular country, is that your country might be the exception, the one that breaks out and sort of has a bit of success. We can see the likes of historically Chile in Latin America was kind of considered this exception to the rule
Yeah,
of the rest of the region. Um, uh, but again, that comes at a cost often to the citizens. It comes at a cost to the environment of the country. Um, but it's also, there's a question of the sustainability of that more broadly.
yeah,
So I would say that the action needs to be ideally coordinated, and when things have gone in more positive directions, that has been the sort of basis. You look at the relative success of the non-aligned movement in the early years of the UN, particularly when um, rapidly decolonizing countries were joining the UN and acting, I think, more in unison, and seeing their shared interests. But now, I think that we have again that rule, that by which, as you mentioned, enabled the British to rule a huge empire, global empire, from a small island,
yeah,
is divide and conquer, and we can see that very strongly, I think, across much of the global south. And corruption then is one of the forms that takes. I would say corruption is a symptom of that world system. That's not to absolve individual who are corrupt from any blame. But
Yeah.
it's not only those who take bribes that are corrupt, it's also those that seek to push them and offer them in the first place.
Yeah.
And what we've seen down through history, as I mentioned, is those that resist that. We can think of examples and from across Africa and Latin America, those who sought to resist the sort of lure of corruption and say, no, we want to do what's right for our country more broadly, have often ended up being put out of power in different ways. So, I think about a former president of Ecuador,
Yeah.
that was, that died in a plane crash around the time that he wanted to take more national control of the oil that was there. And
Yeah.
examples like that are replicated often now. The form that it takes is more what they call a soft coup. Often, the parliament moves against a leader, um, or maybe the military intervenes but very rapidly, and then doesn't take power itself, but installs a sort of puppet leader. But you also see outright military coups as well. So it's very difficult. The lure on the one side is you could become a very wealthy individual if you were prepared to accept um, the bribes and take a percentage of the let's say the natural resources that you're exporting from your country. And on the other side, the route um, of standing up and saying no is you could well be put out of power, imprisoned, or worse. So that's where I think that kind of broader unity is really important, because the forces against you are very strong. And ultimately, I mean, this goes beyond my any level of expertise to talk about in any detail, but it would seem to me fundamental kind of reform of the governance of the United Nations, something like the UN Security Council that sort of locks in the powers of former colonizing countries to sort of to decide on military action. And also the likes of the IMF and the World Bank, which are deeply undemocratic and problematic institutions that hold huge power um, over the futures of billions of people.
Would you think that the organizations like the IMF like have a focus on where the countries they support or the regions they support? For instance, the IMF were one of the main reasons why African countries couldn't even like export actual they couldn't process their commodities, their natural resources, because they had controls, they had regulations that was preventing them from doing that. But if IMF is supposed to be a place where there's justice and fairness, like is this something that's
The IMF is deeply deeply problematic. I mean, it was, I would say, for quite a long time in Latin America in the early 21st century, a key focus of social movements, protest movements, even some kind of broadly left wing governments were very outspoken on this. That seems to have gone off the agenda again. But the IMF is largely, I mean, it's supposed to be there as a sort of lender of last resort, but in fact, it has transformed into the sort of the enforcement arm of neoliberalism, of global neoliberalism, where it's there, as you say, to sort of to maintain this world system where some countries are there to supply either cheap labor or cheap resources, primary resources, without any industrialization, without any real value added. And then you have the countries that are the major donors to the IMF, that are continue to benefit from the system. That also has its, I would say, very different, or certainly different, but there is some reflection of that with the whole aid system as well, because we have known for quite some time that the amount of wealth that flows from aid recipient countries to donor countries far outweighs the amount of aid that flows in the opposite direction, and yet it still allows donor countries to present themselves as altruistic, as doing this out of goodness and not self-interest, and yet
Yeah.
the evidence would suggest that they benefit, yeah, significantly from that relationship. That's not to say that there aren't good people uh, doing very important work, intervening in some terrible situations, and that money isn't very important, particularly for
Yeah.
some of the most vulnerable people who might not necessarily get help otherwise. So
Yeah.
that's a very tricky balance to hold, particularly for large NGOs who maybe see that this architecture is not transformational, right? It's kind of maintaining the system rather than transforming the system, and yet the other option could be something even worse.
There's a lot to take in there. And when we think about, I know that there are, like I mentioned earlier, there are initiatives, sprouting up here and there. I think recently I read that there's been a new acceptance of trade justice initiative being publicly, posted by certain organizations. So it brings back to the nature of deals, being agreed upon. It is this thing, underlying nature about it that is so secretive, which when we bring it back to the global stage, which affects multiple countries, I can't help but think, why does it have to be so shady? We understand that there is a level of deals between individual companies, mergers and acquisitions that seems to be, quiet because of competitors, right? But when you're dealing with a global stage, you're dealing with agreements between countries. Why does it always have to be so quiet and shady? And it just deletes requirements for accountability on all levels.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very good point. And again, I think it just goes back to this system of recognizing that this is a world system, and the world system is engineered largely to benefit the those wealthier countries that sort of oversaw the creation of this world system in the first place. And this is one aspect of it. Um, the way that trade agreements are done, is that whole process is very, very questionable, and the impacts that they have are hugely significant, and yet, as you say, they're very much done secretively, and yet I would say that secretiveness is maybe, it's not universal. I would say there are certainly in some countries, studies done around things like the revolving door between certain industries and
Mhm.
governments in certain countries, where industry executives leave their posts in industry and go into government, and maybe participate in the signing of a trade agreement, or participate in the writing of a law that reduces environmental protection, or reduces labor protections, or reduces taxation, and then they go back to their previous role in the industry. So there, it's not that everyone is necessarily excluded, and there are often windows for big business to participate. But those that are what we generally find when we say, lack of inclusion and participation is a lack of economic democracy, a lack of involvement of citizens, particularly those that are likely to be affected by the impacts of these trade agreements. And so, I mean, as an example, a few years ago, with a sort of interdisciplinary group of researchers, we put together a fairly short paper that examined the EU Mercosur trade deal, that has been under negotiation between the European Union and the Mercosur countries, which is a trading bloc in South America that
Yeah.
includes Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay, as well as some associate members. It's been under negotiation for 25 years. And, a big part of the reason that it has never been signed is that, you know, essentially what the goal of the European Union is to buy cheap natural resources, non-manufactured goods, so agricultural products primarily, um, monocropping, and to sell manufactured goods like cars, things like that, high-tech goods. And so I think the South American countries recognize that this is a questionable deal, but in this world system, this may be um, the best deal for them. But the three sort of principles that we formulated in that paper, that would make this and other trade agreements better, were transparency. And there's a huge lack of information, as you say. It's all very secretive around what is being discussed, what the implications of those are going to be. And these agreements are binding, particularly around the commercial aspects. There are other parts of trade agreements that talk about democracy, that talk about sustainability, that typically aren't really binding, but the trade aspects are very much legally binding.
Mm.
And yet, who knows anything about this? The second principle was inclusion, particularly of communities, indigenous peoples. These are often the people that are most directly impacted. It's often where they live. That we're going to see more expansion, say, of industrial agriculture, because now that there's a trade agreement in place, agribusiness can deforest more, can displace peoples from their lands, can divert rivers, can pollute soil, water, and air. And so all of those impacts are going to be felt by people who have no say at all in the signing of the agreement. And then the third principle was enforcement, particularly around these sort of things that I mentioned. If you're going to have a sustainable development chapter in a trade agreement, but it has no enforceability, it has no mechanism, then what is this worth? And you know, in a few years ago, in Peruvian civil society came together to bring a complaint to the European Commissioner for Trade, particularly around labor, because the trade agreement had incentivized the agribusiness to create a whole legal regime that allowed them to pay less than the law said, pay less than the minimum wage, and to hire people on sort of in unstable contracts, precarious contracts. And so the Peruvian civil society brought a complaint saying this goes against what's in the trade agreement, and the EU just did nothing. Um,
Wow.
and so, we can also see, I suppose, around trade agreements, there's something else that's worth mentioning, because the EU and Mercosur one is a region to region trade agreement, but huge numbers of trade agreements have a massive disparity of wealth and power. You know, the European Union a long time ago had a goal that it would only sign trade agreements with other trading blocs, but it abandoned that. So the European Union has signed trade agreements with individual, much smaller countries. Now think of the disparity in wealth and power, um, when the likes of Ecuador, which is quite a
Yeah.
small country, has a trading agreement with the European Union.
Yeah.
And of course, I mean, the European Union was just following in the footsteps of the US,
Yeah.
in that way, with the likes of NAFTA and various other um, trade agreements. So there's trade and trade agreements are two separate things. Trade is something that humankind has done since forever. Trade agreements are very different. They establish a whole legal architecture, and they sort of lock the parties into certain types of economies.
Yeah.
And particularly but if they're between, say, two similarly wealthy blocks or countries, even then they're probably not that problematic. Although the whole CETA deal with Canada was problematic because it contained ISDS.
Mm.
Um, but particularly when they're signed between blocks that are very different in terms of power, that's much more problematic.
Yeah, because they have more leverage, right? That makes sense. So when we think about, like you mentioned, the trade agreement seems to be the main elements really uh, being the problematic thing causing these like countries, having situations with their economies. Do you feel or don't you think maybe there's an element of restructuring within the engineering of administration in today's time, because most of these agreements date back 40, 50 years, and I think people don't understand the level of money being passed through. We're talking hundreds of billions year in, year out, right? So they are gaining so much, and that's why they will do everything to make sure it stays the same way. But my question is, does this responsibility, how do you see this restructuring happening? Do the people, have to start coming together, making more noise in a structured manner, having platforms where these conversations can really come into place, and innovations for a global accountability system, which can definitely be done by engineering, what I mean, softwares and stuff? Or is it something that has to be done by other organizations, activist organizations, really pushing it on the forefront? Or is it something that needs to be done by the governments of those countries that are on the weaker foot?
I mean, I would say, first of all, it's not only trade agreements, as I mentioned, these bilateral investment treaties that are hugely significant and tend to receive a lot less a lot less attention, and they were very, very secretive. I mean, at least trade agreements, usually citizens, civil society are aware that a trade agreement is being negotiated. They may have zero input into that process, or a very, very minor, very discreet input into it, but they do know that they're taking place usually. Whereas with many of the bilateral investment treaties, that was not the case. They were signed without any oversight or transparency whatsoever.
Okay.
Um, in terms then of restructuring, it's very difficult. I mean, I mentioned already the cases of Ecuador and Honduras in terms of like trying to extricate yourself from this,
Yeah.
particularly as an individual country. Now, if you were to organize, regionally, then maybe there's more possibilities there. But it's still very challenging without some sort of global agreement, and the powers that are um, have no interest, I would say, in any significant structural reform of the system as it is, because it benefits the wealthy countries. It enables them to postpone or put off or avoid difficult political decisions. The wealth generated from the global south, has enabled a very good standard of living, generally speaking, in the global north. But it isn't one that everyone can avail of. We know that for a fact, because the boundaries of the planet are set. We cannot have unlimited growth on a finite planet, and not everybody can live in the way that the average person, middle class person in Ireland lives, even though
Mm.
those people don't consider themselves wealthy. But we would need at least three planets um, for everyone to live in that way. And so, in terms of principles of justice, would dictate that the wealthy countries and those of us in the wealthy countries need to reduce, our level, particularly our level of consumption, but also things like how much travel we do, how much emissions we generate, how much energy we use, just how much stuff we have, and how often we replace that stuff. I'm talking fast fashion. I'm talking about built-in obsolescence. But the system as it stands enables governments in places like Ireland to not have to make those difficult and unpopular political decisions, because they can continue to generate cheap cheapened materials produced with cheapened labor or cheapened resources from the global south. So it's really important to understand. I think that this system not only benefits the wealthy in the global north, but also the average person too, and politicians. So, I mean, and where this is, I suppose, coming to a head is around the climate crisis. But again, what we can see is that the countries that are most responsible for the climate crisis. So, you talk about somewhere like Malawi, where we work, is basically has zero responsibility at all for the climate crisis, and
Yeah.
yet is paying huge costs in terms of impacts. Um, so not only financial, economic costs, but also human costs in terms of people dying, in terms of people's lives being shortened,
Hmm.
um, and they're receiving, nowhere near the sort of climate finance that they would need, and what is being given is often given in the form of loans, which is just another way to maintain the system, because it maintains those countries then as dependent on and subservient to the lender countries. So yeah, so there's it's a very uh, difficult to see where the incentives are in the global north to reform the system. So it has to come from I think it has to come from the south, but that has to be coordinated. It has to be a united front, and but until such time as we get past this divide and conquer, where certain individuals within states can become very, very wealthy by playing along with this system, or in slightly better cases, certain countries can advance by playing along with this system. Um, it's very, very difficult, because each, if you're president of, I don't know, X country, whatever country in Africa or in Latin America, you
Hmm.
know, you can see, there's a path that is taking money and becoming very wealthy yourself. There are risks to that, of course. But depending on where you are, those risks might be quite low that anyone's ever going to imprison you. Or if you are, more, let's say, patriotic, and you were to say, right, what can we do? Well, at least I could get my country to be better than all the other countries in the region. We could benefit then, and I could enhance the lives of our citizens within our borders, but that will, be at the expense of my neighbors. That's another option. And the third, far more difficult option, is that, some sort of common cause is found between neighboring countries to say, no, we see this system and we want it, it needs to be reformed. The IMF needs to be reformed, the World Bank needs to be reformed or gotten rid of entirely. You know, but it's difficult to see an easy path
Yeah.
to that, because you're up against very powerful interests. And so things like, getting out from under bilateral investment treaties and ISDS would be a huge step in the right direction. But even that is very difficult.
But if in the case that nothing changes for the next century, what do you see the landscape, the new landscape looking like, especially for both sides of the power scale?
Yeah, I mean, you could go very dark on this very quickly, but I think we kind of have a lot of that going on in the world as it is. We, in particular in the global north, we live in a world that is built on injustice and unsustainability, and that's what gives us the lives that we enjoy, and that is an uncomfortable truth. I think where I see hope is in the organizing that's going on, particularly in the global south, and to some extent supported by solidarity in the global north. I think the role of the solidarity often in the global north often gets overstated, but again, we're closer to the main centers of power and communications and so on. But you look at something like, and again, it was a victory, but there was a huge regional campaign that was involved governments, but not led by governments in South America back in the early 2000s, when George W. Bush was the president of the United States. And they wanted to create what they called the free trade area of the Americas. This was going to be like a NAFTA trade agreement, which some people may
Okay.
know as the North American Free Trade
Yeah.
Alliance. That includes Canada, the US, and Mexico. This was going to be like that, but incorporate all of South America. And again, what it would have done would be to lock those governments into their role only as providing the most basic primary commodities. It would not have stopped, as we've seen in the likes of Mexico, it would not have stopped the US from continuing to go against the rules of free trade by subsidizing farmers and so on within its own borders. Um, so we saw something like in Mexico where corn was the staple crop of the Aztecs and a sacred crop has been destroyed by
Wow.
NAFTA. But we had a huge, particularly like civil society, social movements in particular, rose up against this, and there were protests right across the region, to the point where many people running for government had to suddenly say that they were against this. Even if nothing in their background would suggest that they had ever been against it before. um, and the whole initiative was killed. Now, I mean, there was also a moment there because it came around the time or shortly after the illegal war in Iraq, and so there was a geopolitical side to it too, where George W. Bush was extremely unpopular globally. But things like that, show that there is some possibility for change. But stopping a system from being implemented is definitely more straightforward than unpicking a system that is already in place. But I do think that um, on a democratic sort of basis alone, the trade agreements, the terms of those trade agreements, and those bilateral investment treaties, as one part of this whole world system that I talked about, you know that there is valid grounds for doing that. Who were those that signed these agreements and agreed to these terms, and we've seen something of that success in the whole debt movement, where much of the debt that was incurred by the global south was done by undemocratic means, by governments that use it to you know fuel corruption and not to benefit the people. And so there has been success at sort of debt cancellation efforts and things like that as well. So there are some important victories to build on.
Okay.
But I suppose I feel like recognizing what it is that we're sort of up against is an important first step to
Yeah, it is. Well, I hope that's been able to shed some lights, in different aspects of things. When you put some of the topics we discussed on today, how much would you categorize as falling under what we call the contemporary slavery in today's world?
Yeah, I mean, I think that concept of kind of modern slavery or contemporary forms of slavery, as the UN referred to it, it was an interesting. It's an interesting area, I think, because in fact, what are talked about now as modern slavery, modern forms of slavery, aren't actually modern at all. They're actually forms of bondage, of human bondage, that go back. Um, uh, they go back centuries, and existed alongside chattel slavery, or what we tend to refer to as slavery. But that idea of sort of ownership, um, in perpetuity of a human being, and the trading of human lives. But there have always been different forms of bondage. Slavery has existed in a lot of places, usually with regard to prisoners of war. Um, and so, the Atlantic slave trade and the chattel slavery that it created was the most extreme by far, and version of this kind of exploitation. And it was largely, very slowly, challenged and rolled back. And again, the history of that is interesting because there's one side of that history that focuses on the global north, on campaigns by anti-slavery societies and petitions and meetings and so on. And then there's another side of that, which is the sort of real economic power that was being challenged by slave rebellions, by maroon communities, by actions by individual enslaved people to push back against their exploitation and enslavement. And so, but those other forms, like the likes of debt bondage in the Indian subcontinent, that existed alongside chattel slavery, that continues to exist now. So to think of it as modern isn't really true. These are old forms of exploitation. The point is that um, they're very challenging to eliminate.
Mhm.
Because passing a law is not really uh, is not really something that you can do. But also they they benefit that they're part of that whole world system that
Yeah,
cheapened labor. I mean, when we think of the worst cases, then definitely we can talk about something that is akin to or similar to chattel slavery, but there's a whole spectrum there that is very beneficial to the world system that mightn't necessarily, cross that invisible line into being slavery, um, but is definitely exploitation. And that is not considered abhorrent. So it's an interesting dichotomy where certain types of exploitation are considered abhorrent by the Western world in particular, but other forms are considered just, you know, just regular work, so
yeah,
and so I think that's been, I mean, one of the interesting cases is Brazil, um which was one of the, if not the largest slave nation in the world. I mean, one of the things that I had not really realized until I started researching this years ago was how relatively small the trade toward the United States was. I think the estimates are around 100 million human beings
wow,
transported into there, as opposed to, I think, around 5 million into the Caribbean, and maybe I could be wrong on the figures, but several
yeah,
million into Brazil.
wow,
Um, and so Brazil is a slave society. I mean, there's huge numbers of people there who have ancestry that were enslaved people, and yet the laws, etc., have been, rarely written to benefit those people. But there was a very strong movement in the sort of late 20th century and into the early 21st century of trade unions, of formerly enslaved people, and of kind of religious organizations coming together. Again, really strongly, really powerful campaign to put this idea of what they call slave labor into their laws. And they've created a criminal offense of enslaving people that has a really interesting definition, because it doesn't just talk about that you coerce someone and exploit them. It also talks about things like what kind of hours you're forced to work, what kind of conditions you're forced to work in. It really focuses on this idea that this is offense against human dignity. And whereas what we tend to find in much of the rest of the world is the only real time that slavery is really easy to see is when there's violence involved. And yet, as we know, the kind of neo-colonial system that we work in doesn't often require violence to exploit people. So yeah, so it's an interesting area to look at, because a lot of the activism, not the sort of activism in Brazil that I was talking about, but a lot of the bigger, kind of organizations, anti-trafficking organizations, etc., have very little to say
yeah.
about economic inequality, have very little to say about corporate power. They tend to focus very much on sort of gangs and individuals like that. Yeah, they don't really take a wider view on these things, in my view.
Maybe intentional as well. Well, yeah. No, because I have studied the trajectory, the tradition, the trend of this division, this aspect of division. It seemed to be a system that worked in the past, and it had evolved into different forms today. But understanding that before the level of division we have today on the social platforms really emerged, people were actually focusing on policies, and the protests were focusing on changes and stuffs within the political system. But today, the majority of the discussions online are not even close to those directions. The main topics are about our differences, even though they might not really be prevalent or so clear. So I start to understand that there are certain, like you mentioned, the powerful forces want to maintain this position. So it's it's logical to think that they make some moves. They take some actions to maintain this position. They don't just think because we don't sign this new deal, things continue to be. But we have to take that proactive action to maintain this position. But that's a topic for another day. I would like to end on one of our traditions, so which is you share your perspective, your vision of a better Africa. So, in my vision of a better Africa, I imagine, and you can just give us, your vision of a better Africa.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of my vision for a better Africa, I think I would see more justice in terms of redistribution. I would see I would see more prominence of African knowledge and culture being sort of globally you know recognized. I think Emma Dabiri, who's an Irish Nigerian scholar and
Yeah.
commentator, written a powerful book where she talks about like global culture being African culture being global culture. Its impacts and its roots and are everywhere in everything that is considered sort of global culture these days. It's
Yes.
remarkable. Um, and yeah, I mean, I would like to see you know the kind of at its best in terms of the sort of sustainability of lifestyles in Africa being more of a model for other parts of the world. But I'm also conscious of this huge beast, that's the climate crisis, and there's I think again it's something that Africa has zero responsibility for, but is going to pay a huge cost for, and so that has to be recognized in terms of action and finance by the global north, but not in the sense of we're doing you a favor or we're giving you a loan. But these should be, this should be, on the basis of responsibility, and that links also to another one that I would love to see, which is, serious reparations for the transatlantic slave trade. I know that Keir Starmer was confronted with this, and it's something that seemed far fetched until you recognize that uh, that the British slave owners in the Caribbean, were compensated to the tune, I think it was £4 million at the time, which the British state only finished repaying in 2015. Um,
Wow.
so, you know, this, there were reparations at the time of the abolition of slavery, but they were to the slave owners and not to the enslaved.
Wow.
And so, again, this is another huge issue. And then the final one, just to mention some of the work that I suppose, been doing, which is on trying to formulate laws at different levels. So at kind of global level, a regional level at the EU, and at a national level across the world, but specifically in my work in Ireland, to hold corporations to account and to provide access to justice and um, you know, gender responsive practices and laws, across the world. And Africa has actually been, as a bloc, been very progressive on ongoing negotiations for a UN treaty on business and human rights, a UN treaty to hold corporations to account. And I mean, I think that's great to acknowledge that powerful voice that African nations have brought, and that sort of level of unity as well, which again I mentioned I think is really important. And I'd love to see that treaty get signed, and I'd love to see it be maybe a starting point for more unity in the region.
Amen. Thank you. Well, just want to say thank you for sharing your insight, Chris. Your insight has really been inspiring, and we're definitely grateful for having that on the Proudly Made in Africa podcast today. Thank you once again. God bless you.
Thanks very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.